Government is faced with a dilemma as the country plunges into a technical recession. Did we see it coming, or did it take us by surprise? A lot of people saying it took us by surprise. Well, retracing our steps back to 2009, during the country's last recession, the government came up with new growth path, an economic framework that was meant to create 5 million jobs by 2020 and bring unemployment rate down to 15%. The new growth path had 6 priority areas to job creation: infrastructure development, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, the green economy and tourism. Then there was the new development plan with its 2030 targets. So between then and now, what went wrong? Arabile Gumede is here in studio with me, SABC Econ Journalist, to talk us through this chain of events that has led to us to this stage. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, for allowing me here.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. So listen, I mean, I've gone through those grand promises that were made. Yeah. And I mean, when we go down that timeline, it looked like that in 2 years' time, because we're sitting in 2018 now, South Africa was going to be the new Garden of Eden when it came to job creation and a thriving economy and doing so well. We are the polar opposite of what was promised.
Completely, right? I mean, as you said there, the new growth path was meant to take us to 15% unemployment. We're still sitting at ever closer to 30%, close to double that. So certainly, we've had a lot of promises and nothing done. Yes, fine, there have been international factors. Yes, fine, there have been global commodity factors, because we're a high exporter, of course, of global commodities. And yes, there have been issues outside of ourselves. But let's remember that we have done it a lot to ourselves. Regulation has not been standard. We've struggled to really find a method and way of formulating a path, whether it be with electricity, whether it be with mining, whether it be with job creation. How exactly do we fund the flow of job creation? And I don't think many people are getting that right. And that is the problem, and that is what has brought us perhaps to this level.
Yeah, it's not, I suppose, thinking out of the box. It's something that we have brought upon ourselves.
Yeah.
But have we? I mean, there have been a lot of things at play as well. And when we look and we read into what we've been over in the last 10 years or so, no economy can handle the amount of money that has been looted, that has been captured.
Indeed.
Our state-owned enterprises have been milked dry. I mean, we've just had an interview now with the chair of the SABC, which of course the SABC falling into that sector as well, having money being filtered out of it. But this is just one of, I mean, we talk about Eskom, we talk about Transnet, we talk about all of these.
That's just the big ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. I mean, this is the beginning of a very long hangover.
It is. Look, they say it's always darkest before dawn, and I will maintain that. It's always easy to become very negative and pessimistic with regards to how things are going in the country. And that picture tells it very clearly. That is what Stats SA released yesterday with regards to South Africa's growth. As you saw, a negative 0.7% GDP figure. Yes, it's massive, and I think economists had expected it to be maybe negative, but not so much so, and some even expecting it to be a little bit positive, even if it's around 0.2%. So it was touch and go, but for that figure to reach that level clearly shows you the complete weakness. For the first time, look at mining. A 5% growth in that mining sector is actually very good. But in the contrast of everything else that seems to be happening in our economy, it's really bad. And let's remember that 4.9% increase means that mining, which occupies around 8% of South Africa's GDP, it hands off to 8% of GDP. And that was the biggest gainer. And yet agriculture, which for the longest time has been in the doldrums, and at some point was managed to gain somewhat as well, now falling nearly 30%. So a big decline there, and maybe we could see it come back. And as you said, yes, we had massive looting. So again, we did do certain parts of this to ourselves. We could have had the right infrastructure in place for things like mining, construction. Let's remember that things like personal services or even government only rise mainly when there's an election. So those, are unlikely to gain. But what has happened to transport? And that's purely because of the petrol price increases. That's because of oil prices. So certainly we haven't been able to adjust to changing factors within the global and local economy. And that is where we probably need to start. Facing the things that we know are a problem locally and getting rid of those.
Yeah. So let's continue to delve into this graphic because this tells a very big story, like you say. mining, which has been the thorn in our side for a very long time, has suddenly made a little bit of a turnaround. However, this is growing, but it's pale in comparison to what's happened to agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, we cannot ignore that we're almost down 30% with growth with agriculture. I mean, that is, I think, what has sent us into the doldrums.
Certainly.
But there are many factors here, and we had our economist in the first hour talking about the fact that there's some things that are out of our control, that being the drought. But what could have been in our control was the fact that we had better plans in place to deal with this drought. Exactly. But let's not ignore the land debate.
Yes.
Because I think that this has played a very big role as well. Perhaps you can shed some light as to, perhaps the impact that this has had on agriculture.
Look, it certainly has. And let's remember that it's not just from a point of view of people getting crops in or growing crops or whatever the case is. It's the continued investment in South Africa's agricultural space, which people are now deterred and shying away from, because they just feel like, well, it certainly hasn't helped us in any way. We're not getting to a point where we know exactly whether our land is going to be ours or not. The land value in South Africa, some agribusiness chambers saying that it could even go to zero at some point, the value of South Africa's land, purely because if you change the constitution to do so, it may mean that you certainly don't have a value to land, because it can just be taken away from you at any point in time. Whether that's true or not is very, is going to be decided by the current review committee on the constitution right now happening in Parliament. And they need to decide very, very carefully how they tread. Do they really change the constitution or do they not? And perhaps we can achieve land reform without it. And that will continue to play a massive, massive role on that agriculture figure.
Yeah, and when you've got voices like the US President Donald Trump coming into the equation, that doesn't help at all.
At all.
But I think the biggest problem is the uncertainty. And it's not about the fact that land reform is being opened, the conversation is being had. It's a difficult conversation, but it is a very vital conversation. But it's the uncertainty surrounding it, and I think the uncertainty with regard to investment coming in, with regard to where we're going with all of this, and that's where the problem is. Perhaps we need more certainty.
We do.
And the faster this happens, the better, because the longer the uncertainty lasts, the more the investment is not going to come in, it's going to go away. Indeed. And that figure is going to get worse.
And sadly, President Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't actually have any leeway, really, to try and fix things. We're already right at the bottom, and we continue to say things can't get any worse.
And
clearly they just keep doing that.
They do.
Here's an interesting statistic for you then, Leanne. 2 months into his presidency, Jacob Zuma had a 2% contraction in GDP between the months of January and June. That's back in 2009. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is facing a combined drop in GDP of 1.7%, and he's been in power for 6 months, right? And that's 9 years a difference.
Sure.
Now, clearly, the sentiment here and the mark is that we clearly aren't doing things fast enough. He needs to come into power as he has to actually make sure that we know that he is changing things around, and that's perhaps the element that's missing. 6 months is enough time to change regulations, and the problem is we're talking too much and doing too little.
Yeah, and that's the big problem. We're going to talk more about that in a short while. We're going to continue this interview, but I want to also look at the issue of our relations with China and where we're going with this, because I was talking at a summit the other day and gave quite an interesting perspective that I had heard from a local manufacturer here in South Africa. They do cycling gear.
Yeah.
And what they do is they go. So I was asking, oh, brilliant, do you get your cycling gear made here locally? They're a very big manufacturer. And they said, no, absolutely not. What we do is we go to China.
Yeah.
So we go to China. We take a week out of our schedule. We go there. We design and get it manufactured in 5 days. The entire range for the year is done in 5 days. So I said, but why don't you do it here? She said, I'll tell you why. Because I've been to local manufacturers here in South Africa. For the 5 days it takes in China, it'll take 7 months to get the same stock made for 4 times the price here locally.
Yeah.
Why would anybody want to do it locally when you can go to China? Now, I know our relations with China, they've got investment coming here and all of this, but that paints a picture now. Where is the job creation? So the job creation is happening in China. It's not happening here. We are paying China to do all of the work, and they bring that money and invest in wherever they're investing. But where does that leave us?
Sadly, I think the primary problem is that we didn't actually invest in manufacturing the way we thought we should have back in the day. And I say back in the day, literally over the last 20 years. I'm not talking about that far a long time ago. I think the issue when we started was that we looked at ensuring that as humans we were all okay, and the economy took a little bit of a back seat, particularly during the first term, the first sort of 5 years when we came out of democracy, or got into democracy rather. And sadly, there were a few issues that we didn't deal with then because, we had other issues of really critical importance at the time. But what that has meant is that we've now lagged behind in everything else, including things like manufacturing. If we invested sufficiently in industrial development in South Africa, we would be leading the fourth industrial revolution. We would be at the forefront of it, ensuring that things like technology play a massive role in it without deterring jobs. Because I think that's the one thing we keep forgetting, is that job creation in itself does not have to exclude human elements. It can actually include human elements with the rise of technology. Technology has to be implemented by somebody. It has to play a role by ensuring that people actually play their sufficient role in making it work. The systems have to work. Designing it needs to come to the fore as well. And that's where we've perhaps gone wrong, that we need to make sure we invest in the right parts of manufacturing.
I love what you're saying there, and it's so true, because at this exact same conference that I was at, we had one of the vice chancellors of the university speaking, and I think you'll find this amazing. I'll tell you the story as we go to an ad break, is that when you look at some of your devices, like, and maybe, I don't know if people can confirm this for me, but if you're trying to talk to Siri, or if you're trying to talk about, she doesn't necessarily understand the Xhosa.
No,
she doesn't. She doesn't get Xhosa.
No.
And she can't understand it, and she doesn't, a lot of apps don't relate to it, and this talking into it, many languages she can, but the one she can't get is Xhosa.
Definitely.
The reality is, we should be developing the applications.
Is that not just the key
to deal
element
with
right
it?
there?
There you go. So that's just a point in case for that story. All right, let's take a break. We'll continue the conversation with Arabile after this, and I think education is something we need to talk about as well. Do stay tuned.